And do we have any public testimony? I didn't see any documents posted or also let me know. Yeah, go ahead.
At this time, we haven't heard from anyone. Are there any members of the public who are present who would like to offer testimony today? If so, if you could unmute yourselves and let us know. Okay.
Okay. Well, welcome to the Board Design and Governance Technical Advisory Group. So first of all, I'll warn you that this is the first time I get to chair one of these Zoom kind of meetings. And while I've chaired my share of real meetings, this is my first Zoom experience. And Bruce, I've admired your ability to keep track of things, and I'm not sure I can quite do that as well, but we'll give it a try.
You'll be great. We'll be gentle, John. Don't worry.
So, you know what I thought we could do this morning, because we're a smaller group, is go around in terms of introductions. And for the 4 committee members, if, you know, we all know each other now, but if you could spend, you know, 30, 60 seconds on what especially is important to you in terms of this governance activity, and you know, anything from your background that you know you think is relevant, I'd appreciate it. And then actually, Laurel and Sarah, I'd appreciate it if you all would introduce yourself. I mean, while we've worked together, I'm not, you know, I'm not quite sure I've ever met you guys. So I'd kind of like to meet you. And you know, Margie, I won't impose that on you this time, but maybe next time, if you could be ready to do the same, I'd appreciate it. And the HMA consultants, next time, if we could have a few minutes to meet each of them and, you know, get to know them a little bit. So John Santa, and I mean, probably my biggest policy interest in all of this can be summarized as around transparency. And most of the stuff I've done in my health policy life sooner or later gets down to a desire for things to be more transparent and for everybody to know what's going on. And that's especially true in terms of the business plan and where the money goes. And so that's a key interest of mine in this, is following the money. I have worked and been involved with 15 different organizations in my life, and I've had some very positive experiences and some pretty frightening ones. And so those color, I think, the take I have on things. Bruce?
Sure. Good morning. Bruce Goldberg. You know, I think when it comes to the governance piece, my big issue is accountability, and I think that it goes along with transparency, as John mentioned. But you know, to me, what I've always been working for in my career around healthcare is, you know, accountability for health, for cost, for quality, for outcomes, and to assure that I think in this plan there's clear accountability for that, and that it's measured, and as John indicated, it's transparent as well.
Deborah?
Yeah, so intellectually I'm scrambling, because both accountability and transparency were at the top of my list. And so I think, you know, if we're going to try to build upon both of those, you know, essential components, for me, it's sort of the responsiveness, right? To what's actually needed in the moment. I think that we create a framework that establishes things, but if and when it's not working to the extent that's built in the guidelines, we need to be able to, sort of respond at the tables that we have to make it a better product, to not just keep doing things the same way that we've always done it. And so for me, it's sort of that responsiveness, and I guess that ties into, who we're listening to, how that information is hitting the governance space, and what they're doing with that information, rather than just gathering it. Are they actually acting upon it to the extent possible?
Thanks. Chuck?
Yeah, so I echo all those, and I guess my if I was going to sort of add a little twist to it, for me it's also that it's be understandable to the common person and to the little guy, and that the governance not be seen as sort of this elite group that understands this unbelievable list of letters that stand for things and terms that people don't understand. It shouldn't be that complicated, and it should be accessible. And so it's that side of it, the accessible. But I'm with you all on the transparency and accountable and following the money and all that. But it's that someone should be able to understand how it works and how they can have input into it and who to go to for decisions and how decisions are made, and that they're not just made by this, the director and the insurance company or the hospital execs, right? They can have a say in that stuff.
Right. Great. Laurel?
Hi, everyone. My name is Laurel Swardlow. As you know, I'm with the Oregon Health Authority. Just a quick background about me, because I don't know how much of my background I have shared with you all. I spent the past 10 years focusing on reproductive health. And I've had the chance to work on governance issues in my capacity as interim executive director of Planned Parenthood Advocates of Oregon, on various ballot measure campaign committee conversations, and then also as co-chair of the Oregon Youth Sexual Health Partnership. I really enjoy the intersection of policy and operations, and I feel like governance is really a lot of the conversations that we're going to are going to be related to setting up structures that can be responsive to policy change, and that can really be at the core of implementation of policy. So I think that's one of the things that really excites me about this work.
Great, thank you. Sarah?
Yeah, good morning. I was not prepared to be camera ready this morning, but I'll unveil myself here for a few minutes. So I'm Sarah Nipper, also with OHA, and I have two roles at OHA. So I am half-time on this 770 project, and then my other half-time I work in the Oregon Public Health Division in our adolescent and school health section as a school health epidemiologist. There's a reason that Laurel is taking the lead on staff support for this governance tag, because this is an area that I have much less familiarity with. But I will just say that the time that I spent a brief period of time working for Blue Cross Blue Shield several years ago, and have been in government on either side of that. And it was really eye-opening for me to see the ways in which governance and organization and transparency, not that government is always known for its transparency, but the ways in which it was very, very different being in a different commercial insurer environment. And so I am really interested in supporting this tag and figuring out, putting forward the values that you all have spoken to around transparency and accountability and accessibility for something that truly will be open and usable for Oregonians. So I'm going to go back off camera now.
Thank you. All right, well, I think that's a great start, and we'll devote a little bit of time each meeting, I think, understanding some of the folks who are on the call. A forewarning, we are going to invite some guests to future meetings, including other task force members. I think, Laurel, at the next meeting, we have our 2 task force members who are members of indigenous tribes to be here and be involved in the discussion, especially with sovereignty in mind. I think that we're going to invite appropriate task force members to each governance meeting and include them in the mix. So keep that in mind. I think just one other comment about my own take. In terms of public testimony or involvement of others in the call, I want to encourage public testimony. That I would hope we could also do it so that we can interact with some of the folks who are testifying, if members want to do so. I think, Chuck, you've enabled that in your work group, and I think that's been productive. And I think there's also circumstances during the course of a meeting in which someone attending may have expertise or a comment that could be meaningful. And if staff or any of you think that someone in attendance should be recognized and asked to comment at any point, just let me know, and I think we could recognize them and I'll try to do that. Before I pass it over to staff, I think we do have a pretty ambitious agenda and a limited number of meetings. And so I think we're going to do our best to get through a lot of content and decisions, and as I like to say, put stakes in the ground, even though those stakes may not be perfect, in order to get a place, if you will, on the agenda of the task force meetings, so that we can have a broader and richer discussion of key issues. And I have some ideas about how to move things along in the interim of meetings, and we can talk about that perhaps during this one. Any other comments members of the work group want to make before we turn things over to the staff and get going on our charge, scope, and expectations? Okay, let's go.
All right, everyone. So before I dive in here, I want to note that the other 3 tags had sort of a standard slide deck for the kickoff. There are lots of ways that I'm going to point out that we envision this tag operating a bit differently. My dog Henry agrees. I'll do my best to keep him as quiet as possible. And one of those ways is, instead of doing the standard kickoff slides that we had for those other meetings, we wanted to instead focus on the legislation and really focus on the charter, because unlike the other tags, we have this scope of work that's left over from those other tags. And so looking at the scope is a little bit more of a complex conversation than the first 3 conversations that we had with respect to the tag charters. All that said, we started all of the tags by grounding the scope in Senate Bill 770, and we wanted to make sure to do the same for this tag. I did my best to go through and pull the components of the bill that specifically call out governance I am confident that there are other places in the bill that relate to the content of this tag and that may call out governance explicitly that I missed, but these felt like the core components, and indeed they were the components that the draft scope for this charter were all linked to when we pulled the charter together months ago, and then again when we revised the charter that you have in front of you in your meeting materials today. So the main place that governance comes up is in this section 6, subsection 4, or excuse me, in section 6. Most of them are in subsection 4, I believe. So as you know, the bill calls for the creation both of a plan and of a board. It requests that the task force offer recommendations that relate to governance and leadership of the board, specifically focusing on composition and representation. It asks for clarity on what components of statutory authority would be necessary. It speaks to ethical standards, specifically as they relate to economic conflicts of interest. Related to that, wanting the task force to think through what steps would be necessary to ensure that there's no disproportionate influence of any member of the board. Going on, there's a focus of the board being an entity that focuses on cost control, on economic sustainability, operational efficiency, and cost control measures. As related to that, it speaks to fiduciary requirements, requesting that the task force consider what fiduciary requirements would be necessary for the revenue generated to fund the plan. To that end, it specifically calls out that there be a dedicated fund that is a public trust. A lot of these, let me pause and say, a lot of these terms are terms that we're going to be parsing apart over the course of this tag to try to gain more specificity and a shared definition for these terms. Fiduciary requirements and public trust are two of those terms, so I wanted to call that out here. And again, related to these fiduciary requirements, thinking through required accounting methods that would eliminate the potential for misuse of public funds. And then lastly, it really, it highlights a handful of other components that I think interact, again, as I said, with governance. But these were the ones that we also wanted to highlight from section 6, subsection 4, bonding authority that may be necessary, a process for the board to develop goals, objectives, ongoing review, the appropriate relationship between the board and regional or local authorities is specifically called out in the bill. And then a process for reviewing and resolving complaints that come from the public. So that's everything that was in the bill. As I mentioned, the task force has already done a lot of work and has already started thinking through some of the intricacies of the plan that are going to be enumerated in the report. And to that end, some of those questions that we just outlined, the task force has started to sketch out some answers to some of those questions, which in some ways take some of the work off the governance tag plate. In other ways, may create new questions and or add additional work. And one of the main places that we see that happening is in the provider tags proposal that there be regional entities that kind of are this intermediate step between the single payer and the providers. This was a slide that the provider tag thought through in one of its brainstorming meetings, and I thought it might be helpful to include in this deck just to outline, because in many ways this is somewhat of a start of a structure, somewhat of a start of of relationships between these various entities. And I think one of the things that this tag is gonna be charged with, or is going to need to work through, is fleshing out these relationships even further. Specifically as it relates to the single payer, the relationship between the single payer and the regional entities. So all that in mind, as I said, there was a charter that was drafted back in July or August that was drafted when the other tag charters were drafted. And I believe you all had a chance to look at that in September or October. We revisited that charter, and we felt like there were ways to refine it and to hone in on the scope a little bit in a manner that might better reflect really a lot of the questions that some of the other tags were asking this particular group. But also to make sure that we are really prioritizing what's left, and making sure that we're prioritizing what's left in a manner that makes sense in the governance scope. So to that end, we created, staff worked with Dr. Santa and with the folks at Health Management Associates to pull together the draft charter that you have in your meeting materials. And there are really 4 sections. The first is having some conversation that relates to mission, values, and goals. The second, the structure and role of the single payer. Third, the structure and role of the regional entities. And fourth, a conversation about what authority is needed for those entities to be able to serve in those roles. So what I'm going to do here is walk through what we pulled together. And then we're going to turn it over to you and ask you all, what do you think of this scope? What do you think of this charter? Does it make sense? What's missing? What might you want to tweak? And then we'll think through how we can work through all of that in the timeline that we have over the course of the next couple months. So Dr. Santa really, I think, was a driving force behind including this in the charter, and I'm really glad that he did. The bill specifically does offer in section 4 what we see as somewhat of a starting place for values that the board could use. We talked about how we are not going to have the capacity to take on a robust values conversation or even a robust mission conversation that would potentially take up all of the time that we had. What we're proposing here is more that the tag offer direction on the mission and values, potentially offering direction that the board turn to section 4 as a starting place for the values conversation that the board will have when the report and subsequent policy is implemented. So this, in many ways, I think is the meat of this tag, and there are a lot of questions here related to the structure and role of the single payer. We talked through how we wanted to organize this. There were lots of additional questions that we decided to leave off at this juncture to try to carve this scope of questions. But I still will say I do see it as a robust scope specifically for this item on the charter. Thinking through what are the responsibilities of the single payer, determining the role as it relates to cost containment, thinking through kind of the structure of this entity. Is it quasi-public? Are there filing status requirements? Are there requirements you want to offer that relate to subsidiaries? To whom does the single payer report? Offering guidance on structure of the board. Again, these conversations that relate to fiduciary requirements, and specifically guidance regarding the definition of the term public trust. And then how will public health be integrated into this system? We additionally added this question about how will the board respect tribal sovereignty. And I'm realizing it didn't make its way onto this slide, but I know that that's listed in the document that you have in front of you. That should be listed there as well. It's making me nervous now that maybe there are other edits that didn't make their way onto here. So I'll when you guys are discussing, I'll make sure to look back and see what happened there. So, you know, one of the big questions that came out of the provider tag was turning to governance for guidance on the relationship between the single payer and regional entities. And in order to kind of parse apart that relationship, there's a very similar conversation that you will have with respect to the single payer that I think you're going to want to have with respect to the regional entities. What are the responsibilities of the regional entities? What are their roles in cost containment? Again, is it public or quasi-public? Are there requirements related to filing status? That relationship question, I think, is really the core question here. And how will the single payer and regional entities navigate circumstances that give rise to unexpected financial hardship? That was a core question that came out of that provider tag that they really wanted to turn to you for guidance on. So lastly, what authority do these entities need in order to function and operate and serve the role that you are all discussing over the course of this tag? What authority is needed to administer the plan? What authority is needed to perform enrollment processes, to collect revenue, again, to control costs? Questions with respect to submitting waivers. And here, are there questions related to tribal sovereignty? I'm now remembering, John, that in an earlier iteration, that question's there. I actually believe that's the only switch that we're going to need to be tracking on this slide deck as compared to the charter that you have in front of you. So these are the four kind of buckets of work and of questions that are outlined in this charter as we've tried to hone in on it. And I really want to kind of open up the floor to a conversation about your thinking on this charter. Does it make sense? Does it feel like the right scope? Again, what's missing? What might you want to tweak? So I'll go ahead and kick it back over to all of you.
Thanks, Laurel. So who wants to go first?
Yeah, so thank you to everybody who contributed to these slides. I think they capture a lot of what needs to be done. I think, and as I was thinking and listening, to how you framed it in the context, I agree, I think, with everything, except I did pause when you mentioned that the values, which I believe are foundational to what we're doing, is going to be determined at some later date, which makes me nervous. If I'm being completely transparent, I am fearful that it may default back to the status quo. And so I am just very concerned about not outlining some parameters or guideposts or framework for those values, and just leaving that up to whatever entity we hand it off to. I have very big concerns about that.
Thanks, Deborah. Bruce?
Uh, Yeah, I would agree with Deborah. I think we could maybe um, quickly come up with some sense of values and direction. I don't think it needs to be a long conversation. But having said that, I think the scope you've outlined is great. I think it is uh, it- it's aggressive. I think we're going to have to work hard to achieve all that. And I think each of those issues are really, really important. And so I'm glad to see them there. And I hope we get through them all. I guess my last comment would be um, more one for all of us to consider going forward is that my sense is, and John, you sort of alluded to this, and Laurel as well in the beginning, that our group is sort of taking on sort of some bits and pieces that aren't being covered elsewhere. And I think we may, my sense is there may be some additional things and that we be open to that, particularly if we get an extension.
Right. Yep. Thanks, Bruce. Chuck?
Yeah, I hope we get the extension because this list is not short. And I'm in the same place in the values. I think we should also be mindful of sort of tagging when we're about what values are coming up in our discussions of things. So I think we should have an initial brief discussion and see what we can incorporate from the different tags that have done the values work. And then, but I also don't want to get bogged down in that. I want to sort of get something and then maybe be just conscious of always sort of checking back as we have discussion about particular items, about whether we should go back to coming up with a value that's going to help us make a decision.
Right. Right. Well, my own comments were, I think in large part, I was interested in doing the task force because of the value statements in this section 4. I find them to be very unusual. I've worked for 15 health related organizations, and I don't think any of them had values that were as inspiring as these. And in particular, number one, you would think that maybe, health systems, hospitals, et cetera, would have something like that. Maybe some of them do. It certainly, I've done business or worked with and kind of worked for, I'm sad to say, businesses that their first value was to return, a reward on investment to the shareholders. That's just totally unacceptable to me. I'll put my cards on the table from a value point of view. I feel so strongly about that value that not only do I think it should apply to the single payer, but I would argue it should apply to everybody downstream that's reasonable. Doctors are organized in for-profit groups, but in my mind, they should not organize in publicly traded for-profit companies, because that's, I think, a disaster when it comes to healthcare, and that's out there and has been for a while. So, I found these to be inspiring. I'm sure a planner or strategic planner could wordsmith these to be a bit more efficient, especially number 2. There's just a lot of words there, but they're meaningful words. And by the way, I think in section 4, there's a 4th one that relates to the public trust. That's a brief statement about the public trust. And I don't think we're ignoring that. You saw it. you know, and other places in this discussion. So, you know, we might want to put it back in there, but I would agree with what's been said. I think it would be good to have at least some discussion of this and bring this to the task force and reinforce that in whatever we do going forward, these values should be a driving force. So I think they should be a priority for us and important, and maybe we can have the discussion we need to have about them today, and you know, get that moving.
Are there other thoughts that you'd all like to offer with respect to the other portions of the charter? Or is now a good time to pivot to, I'm on board with knocking one of these items out ahead of time if we can. So if there is a conversation with respect, if there's a further conversation with respect to values, I would definitely encourage you all to have that now.
Well, so I'll chime in. You know, when I look at this, I agree with John. I like them. I think there are a couple things missing. And I think it really gets at one key point of the goals of the single payer, which isn't just about healthcare, but it's actually about health. And we had a little bit of this discussion at our last task force meeting about, you know, benefits. And, you know, John, you brought up the point about, you know, this isn't just about getting, you know, more health care, that sometimes that can be dangerous. There's low value care, et cetera. But that I think we need to have somewhere a focus on health as being a mission and a value of this, not simply getting health care. That's one point. And the other, and I don't know how to wordsmith this or get that in there, I think gets at one of the fundamental issues of our current healthcare system, which is affordability at all levels to, you know, individuals, to the public, et cetera. And, you know, one of the reasons, I mean, these are all tied together. We don't have universal health care because it's too expensive. It's too expensive because we pay for a lot of waste and inefficiency and low value care. And, you know, at some point we have to create something that is, you know, affordable for everybody.
Right, affordable both to the consumer getting the healthcare as well as to the system.
Yes.
Right. Right. You know, after yesterday's meeting, someone sent an email saying, well, you know, the problem is that healthcare costs rise faster than the economic growth. And so, you know, we can't have a revenue system that's based on economic growth because it's not going to succeed, right, if we don't control costs. And so I think affordability is really important.
Yeah. You know, Bruce, your comments made me wonder, you know, anticipating the regional discussion, whether there somehow should be a statement in there that the single payer, you know, desires to allocate resources across the entire state and do so in a way that's fair, and in a way that, you know, results in a healthy economy. You know, one of the things I personally feel really strongly about is what a key role health has come to play in the economy of all of Oregon. You know, that you go to Southern Oregon, you go to Eastern Oregon, and the top employers are all healthcare companies and CCOs. And that has made such a huge difference. The communities know that. They know that in the last 10 years, something big has happened in terms of resources coming into their communities that wasn't there before, you know, and I mean, to some degree, it's an equity issue. We heard that, I think, in the provider tag and in other aspects, the feeling that rural Oregon is just not treated fairly, that this just can't be Portland centric. You know, to me, that's the major role of whatever we come up with regionally. The single payer has to have a presence throughout Oregon that assures the public that the health in that section of Oregon is a priority, and the economic health is a priority.
I think that's great. So your comment got me thinking, like, you know, because we don't have that now, so we do these Band-Aids, like let's do all these things to try to make it so docs will practice
Right.
in a rural area. No, we should pay them. There's people who would go there because they want to be in the rural area, and we shouldn't have all these extra systems that are just complicated and end up being inefficient to deal with the issue of getting rural docs there. And it also made me think about, Silverton, it is the major employer, that in the school system, right?
Right.
And I'm not so sure that many people understand it about the health. On the other hand, you know, our school's CTE stuff has a big health component where a lot of kids do stuff at doctor's offices and up at the hospital to go into health careers. And I just went in for an ultrasound today, and it was a young student there. And so, I sort of wonder if the CCOs now, if high schools and whatnot are sort of recognizing it because of the growth of the CCOs that you talked about. But I think that's very good point, John. The affordability and the important role of healthcare in our economy.
Yeah, I guess I'm trying to contemplate, given the fact that, we've pointed out that there's this huge inequity, right? And that all of these, incentives, tax incentives aren't really driving it. That again, if we're going to drive, for example, providers into these areas, that it is also about infrastructure. So, I'm constantly thinking, would healthcare be enough to sustain it, especially for folks early in their career, right? It may last for a minute until they get experience, and then they're off to Portland, right? Or someplace else. So we got to think about that. And so I'm trying to figure out what more it might take, and if in fact healthcare is the primary industry in most of these areas, how that complicates us trying to disrupt the current system, because so many individual people are invested in the current economics of the system the way it is, right?
Right.
I can't shut off the policy lobby piece of my brain to say that I could almost anticipate folks saying, this new system is going to disrupt the thing that you have, right? And so I'm trying to navigate, not rightfully, because that's not where we are in the conversation, but it's something that is triggered every time we talk about how we're going to change this, and how big of a market and how many interests they've already sort of got looped into what's going on currently. So,
Right.
Not that we need to do anything about it, but I just wanted to put that out as the wheels in my head are turning.
Right. Well, Deborah, as you speak, I think, there's the healthcare functions that are certainly the majority of the economic flow. But then there's non-traditional healthcare functions, and there's administration.
That's right.
And I think that's what the CCOs have brought to their regions. That, to a great degree are centralized in more traditional systems. I saw this a bit because when I was first at Blue Cross Blue Shield of Oregon, which Sarah, that was 1985 to 97 when you spoke about that. Really, we were making the transition from the Blue Shield system was decentralized. There were bureaus throughout the state that, as I traveled throughout the state, I was amazed how many doctors and how many business people would say what a key role the Shield Bureau played. And they felt like they had, influence. And now they were going to lose it because it was Blue Cross Blue Shield of Oregon. Everything merged up, in these big buildings in Portland. And we tried, but they were right.
Right.
And to some degree, I think the CCOs have taken that back out there. You go to Southern Oregon and you see the building that All Care has built. It's the nicest building in Grants Pass. They employ, 300, 400 people to do a lot of administrative work that probably used to be done in Portland.
Right.
And that makes a difference. And they emphasized transportation. They've got a very clever system set up to be transporting their folks all over the place. And they also emphasized interpreters, which is another local function. The interpreters need to be there. They need to live there. The community workers need to live there. But I'm not so certain that those community workers, interpreters need to work for hospitals or for physician groups. Maybe they do. I don't know. So anyway, I think there's just a variety of issues that it's nice to have that regional option to decide. No, we're going to take that out of the medical model. We're going to put it into the regional model,
So
do it differently. Yeah.
So, that got me thinking about, you've done more traveling about and looking at CCOs than I have. But I think about in the early to mid 90s when Kevin Concannon was head of DHS. DHS used to have this paper, employee newsletter called Currents. And he did this one article, which I still have a copy of actually, where he said he was at a soccer game and he ran into a guy he knew and he said, "How's your sister?" He knew had mental health problems. And she said, "Oh, she's doing great. She's out of the hospital. She's at such and such a place and she's doing well." And he said, "Well, that's one of our agencies." And the guy said, "No, that's a private, not-for-profit." And he said, "Well, who do you think pays them?" It's DHS. And his comment and his article was about, wouldn't it be great if everybody who got our money had a sign like the highway signs, "Your tax dollars at work," right? Because people don't realize, and I think that's still true today. And I wonder how true it is. I suspect it's very true with the CCOs, that people don't recognize this is your government at work. This is your universal. And when we do it, I want to make sure that people understand this is your universal healthcare. This is your Oregon, whatever cool name we come up with, plan at work, that it might look like a private entity, might look like a nonprofit. It may actually be a nonprofit that you're interacting with, but that they realize it's a part of this public entity. And so that's actually sort of one of the gets me thinking, maybe how do we put that into a value that we make sure that happens? Because that's been a sort of a problem with, I think, the lack of trust in government in general. I think Kevin was onto a good point that, how do we do that? He didn't have the answer, and none of us really do. But I think we should try to make it so that people see that. And it's not transparency, it's just more understanding the connection. Right. It's like when spacing on his name, the former longtime state economist, he used to talk about how the dry cleaner in Pendleton didn't have two cash registers, one for the people who work at the prison and one for the cowboys. That people refer to government as if it's separate from the economy. And we need to make sure that people understand the role of healthcare in the economy and that it is a public entity.
Right. Chuck, it reminds me of just a brief anecdote. I was in Whistler, 10, 15 years ago. And, one of the shops had an incredible deal on winter coats. And so I went down there and got one, and I was so pleased, and I took it up to the cashier, and, they put like an 18%, one of those value-based taxes or something like that. Mm-hmm. And I go, whoa, what's this? And the cash register guy is like a, snowboarder. He's like one of these shredder guys,
Yeah.
And he looks at me, dude, are you from the States? And I went, yeah. And he says, hey, that's our healthcare. That money goes to our healthcare, and we're proud of our healthcare system. You guys, just ignore that. Probably a 20-year-old guy who totally got what was going on in Canada.
Well, and that's why I told John DiLorenzo when he came out with his sales tax proposal, I said, first thing you need to do is hire Madison Avenue, not any Oregon firm, not any political firm, to come up with a new term other than sales tax so that people realize this is for healthcare. So they have that same connections, that even it looks like a sales tax, acts like a sales tax, but it's for healthcare. It's your healthcare fee.
So other comments here. I mean, now, what I'm thinking is that we can, and then Laurel, correct me. I mean, so we can take what we've heard. We can, put some additional points on here. Now, what I'd like to suggest is that we could distribute that, prior to the meeting and give you all the opportunity to, make edits in it, so that we can make progress in the interim by using written documents. No discussions among committee members, everything in writing in the document, and so the next meeting we could bring back a discussion draft that perhaps will be pretty close to something we can take to the task force and start to get responses from them, and perhaps again even share with them prior and ask for their edits. So is that a reasonable thing to do? Okay. Laurel, anything else on this, on the value statement?
For sharing, should we use like a Google Doc? Is everybody good with that? Because you can put it'll track, you can have it track your suggestions and whatnot.
I'll leave. Go ahead, Laurel, whatever's best for you guys.
I was just thinking, I mean, Chuck, you're always the one who has an eye towards public meeting law. Do you feel like that would be, like there's anything problematic about using Google Docs to be having conversations back and forth?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. You should ask someone. I mean, there's got to be a way that people can put in comments and edits. We're not making decisions.
Yeah.
And if the document is ultimately made public, as long as people aren't deleting things, right?
Yep.
There's got to be a way. So I check with Ethics Commission or someone else.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I this conversation about values was very, very helpful for me. Off the top of my head, there's nothing that's jumping out at me that I want to make sure that I'm offering or bringing to the table. I'm happy to think about that further and may chime in when the back and forth edits are happening. I do, before we pivot to talking timeline, I think my big question is there anything else on the charter that you all, at this point, technically we're supposed to be pivoting to talking about the timeline, but I feel like we're having more of a fluid conversation, which totally works. So I wanted to check in about if there's anything else on the charter that you all want to be digging into.
Yeah, I mean, you know, my sense is it's rich with all kinds of things.
Yeah.
I don't think we need to go further today on any of them. We've teed you up on them. If in the interim you see anything that, you know, stands out as an issue. And by the way, I think staff is, Bruce, keeping track of what are these other issues that could end up coming here, which is a sizable number. Not surprisingly, I mean, you know, this is a journey. So
We can push back though.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Well then, pivoting to timeline here. This is sort of the larger timeline that we've been using for January to June. As you know, staff are still working on that June deadline, planning to have a report that would be ready by the end of June to be prepared for a circumstance in which Senate Bill 428 does not pass. Looking at this timeline, we're having our kickoff right now. That leaves 2 more task force meetings before June, and we have 2 more. Well, I guess we have our March task force meeting, and then April and May, obviously. We have 2 meetings currently scheduled in April, 2 meetings currently scheduled in May. What we did is we took that charter and turned it into a work plan, just a general outline of what these meetings could look like. It very much, you know, maps on directly to the way that the charter is organized. Couple things that I want to say here, and they've already been said, but just to underscore, a lot of the other tags operated in a way in which there were conversations that staff sort of listened to, and then attempted to write up options based on those conversations. We see this tag, in order to tackle the work necessary, there's going to be a lot of work needed in between meetings, as John has already mentioned. And so I just want to be underscoring that that's really the only way that we see this work as feasible. We have a deeper bench on this tag than we did in the previous ones, because we do have the contract team, health management associates, on board from the beginning of this tag. And so we are going to be trying to work with them to get content out to you far in advance, so that you can make sure that you've had a chance to review content and ahead of time, but also B, I think that there's, you know, we'll encourage kind of asking questions so that we can really come prepared, hopefully in some cases with questions having been answered that we can highlight during the meeting, but really making sure that we're not having, you know, today's off the cuff conversation about values was, I think, really helpful. But I think the subsequent conversations are going to be more intentional in order to try to tackle all the work. The last thing I'll say is that there is a gap between April 15th and May 11th. We could add a meeting in that time. John, I haven't checked in with you about this, so please let me know if I should just close my mouth. But I wanted to offer it. It would be a haul in to really try to that the reason there's not a meeting at this time is there's a task force meeting that week. It could, though, be beneficial for us to circulate another doodle. We had circulated so many doodles to all of you already that we held off, and we wanted to check in with you on it to see whether or not you would like to just have one last meeting on this calendar, just in case.
You know, Laurel, I think it might be good to have that as an option and have a meeting, you know, perhaps to follow up on the regional issue, to encourage other task force members who have concerns about that, and to especially encourage the public to have input into that concept. And, you know, so the meeting might not be as heavy on staff, but rather, you know, be kind of a feedback session on where we've gotten in the April 15th meeting. Okay.
Yes,
That works.
Yes, I'm open to an additional meeting.
Me too. I prefer if we're gonna do that, we just get it on the calendar now and we can always cancel.
Great. Okay.
Yep.
Chuck, did you want to weigh in?
No, I agree.
Okay. Are you then envisioning? Oh, yes. Okay, that makes sense. We will circulate a doodle for that week. My instinct is that we don't want to have a governance meeting the same day as the task force meeting. Is that correct? Okay. Then we'll circulate a doodle. Otherwise,
And which is the week? The week of?
It's the week of the 29th is the task force meeting. That's the Thursday. So that's just the only date that I know off the top of my head. Okay. So if there are no other comments or questions here for are there any comments or questions with respect to the timeline or the work plan?
Laurel, if I could ask, you know, there are some issues, as you know, I've mentioned some of them, that it seems to me we need an outside helper. Now, maybe that will be HMA. Like, you know, when I see that language about fiduciary requirements, I think, God, we need a chief financial officer type, or, you know, one of those kinds of folks. Or when I see the word authorities, I think we need a lawyer. Well, we got a lawyer, you know, but yeah. And
not licensed.
Deborah's a lawyer as well, right? Right, Deborah, you're a lawyer?
Not licensed.
Okay, got it.
Oh, we got two lawyers.
Unlicensed lawyers.
I mean,
was one fully licensed lawyer, right? Sorry.
You know, I mean, I'm a doctor. I just, my sense of authority is, well, I'm a doctor. I'm the authority on this. That's not going to work here, I don't think. So like that, those fiduciary requirements and authorities things, yeah, we just need to be sure that either the HMA folks are comfortable with that, or, you know.
Thank you for bringing that up. And you know, I know you already mentioned bringing in other task force members to other meetings as well, but bringing in either experts or other task force members. On the expert side of things, one thing that has been interesting to me, and I worry that HMA is gonna get worried about me even bringing this up, but Washington had webinars in between some of their meetings, And I don't know if they have capacity to try to be supporting something like that, but it's possible that that could be a way for us to get some content out to all of you all in a form that's different than just, you know, reading. That could be interesting or helpful, and time, and not, you know, eat up meeting time in meetings. I realized, John, you mentioned that we might want to kind of have a brainstorm of if there are other task force members that we want to be inviting to some of these meetings. I feel like now could be a good time for us to do that. Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Can we
Deborah?
pause for a minute with your webinar suggestion? Because I
Yeah.
kind of like it, I guess. So would those webinars be open to the general public or just for the task force members?
No, they would be posted. They would be posted like meeting materials.
Yeah, I think it might actually, you know, help to build the information gap or fill the information gap if that's something we could do. I like it a lot. I mean, because it would stagger our meetings, right? And so that if folks felt something provoked ideas, they would show up and give testimony or provide public comments for the next meeting, or, you know, or try to get in touch with us through written documents. So I actually like it as we try to build public awareness of what we're doing.
I like it too. I feel like it would only work if everyone was able, all tag members were able to actually set aside the time to watch the webinars. If we want our conversation to be grounded in those webinars. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and the time constraint was why I was on the fence with it.
Yeah, right. So in terms of inviting folks to join, one person that we wanted to make sure to be inviting is Dr. Chadwick, who was lead of the provider reimbursement tag, to that April 15th meeting. As I've been thinking about it, I've been wondering if it makes sense inviting him also to the April 1 meeting, thinking about the fact that you're going to be discussing the role of the single payer, which is going to be inherently related to, in some ways, the relationship with the regional entities. It's kind of a chicken or egg issue that we've been thinking through, that the role will relate to the relationship will relate to the role. So I wanted to throw that out there as a task force member that we may want to be including in April 1 or in April 1 and April 15.
Well, I mean, I'd welcome Chad coming because I think his work group's discussion around these issues has really shaped where we're headed, particularly in terms of the regional entity. You know, I would also think that inviting some of the task force members who you know, are familiar with outside of Willamette Valley. I'll just, maybe this is politically incorrect, but outside of Willamette Valley issues. Like, I think Dwight Dill, because Dwight talks a lot about county health. And you know, one of the governance issues for me that I'm struggling with, Bruce probably has a sense of this, maybe all of you do, is how do we deal with county health? And yeah, it's a challenge, you know, in terms of mental health, public health, because really you have these, 30 some jurisdictions, you know, some who have enormous resources in terms of health and some who literally have none. And they have, I don't want to say sovereignty. They don't have sovereignty like the tribes, but you know, they are very determined to, you know, play a role. And so I think it would be good to have some outside of Willamette Valley task force members come to some of these sessions.
Yeah, the county, your comment about the county is really important because they are so key, and there's certainly a big issue related to Cheryl's interest in behavioral health funding and whatnot. You know, I was able to get into the COVID vaccine stream because of a very responsive county health office that I haven't personally interacted with much prior to this, right? But saw that it was much more responsive than my local hospital or the hospital in state and or my insurance provider.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I am always open to broader collaboration, especially if folks are subject matter experts in a way that isn't reflected currently. I guess my only pause is, what's the criteria? I certainly don't want to have other broad task force members feel like they were left out of the conversation. So, how are we deciding who gets the invitation? And how do we address folks who would have wanted an invitation who weren't asked? So I just want to be sensitive to the dynamic to make sure that folks don't feel like we're cherry picking, to create any weird dynamics to the broader group.
Right.
What do you all think about that? Do we feel like there's a solution to that issue? Is there some type of statement that can be made during the report back?
Yeah, and I don't know that I was necessarily looking for a solution. I just want to deposit as something we may want to be aware of. Just to throw that out there, I'm always thinking of unintended consequences.
I appreciate it.
Well, and to some degree, as we deal with issues that have come from another tag, it seems like we should extend an invitation, or we should at least let those folks know we're going to be discussing this. And, you're obviously welcome to come and listen. If you want to participate, more than as a listener, let us know.
Are other tag members sort of like automatically ex officio members of each other tag? I mean, sort of like if someone was listening in, can they raise their hand and be called on separate from public comment? I mean, it seems to me they should be. And
well, I was going to say John is I think one of the only task force members who does listen in to the other tag meetings and has chimed in.
I'm desperate for human contact. My experience, Chuck, initially was, I'll make a comment or put something in the chat or something like that. Eventually, I felt that for the most part, the tag and the staff had their hands full, and at the same time, I found it incredibly valuable to listen. It's one of my biases, and I struggle with it, is, as a doctor, the best doctors are the best listeners, not the best talkers. And, oftentimes I felt like, oh my God, I really am learning something here by listening to what they're talking about. And so I tried to not say anything eventually and just listen as much as I could, being a bit worried that, as a friend of mine said, I might be coming off as a lurker, I have a friend who oftentimes asks, well, can I come along and not pay anything and I'll just lurk, in the background? No.
Can I chime in here for a second? This is Sarah. First of all, Dr. Santa, I want to assure you that you have never been considered a lurker on EBA. Your attendance and comments have been really appreciated. This is something we talked about as staff really early on because we were a little concerned that TAG members who were in the TAG sort of had like priority as far as discussion and that sort of thing. And we wanted to make sure that not every TAG just became another task force meeting. Thanks, Deborah. But I think that everyone is a little more comfortable with each other and roles and processes. And so I think, your idea of inviting folks, and also like if you're discussing EBA issues or you're discussing provider issues and folks from that tag are going to weigh in, I mean, that feels like a really different thing to me than a member of the public offering testimony.
Right.
So yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I would benefit, John, if you shared that with the full task force. I mean, I think that's great.
Yeah.
We don't, we have a packed agenda for this upcoming task force meeting. There's not an official governance tag report back because we're trying to be reviewing eligibility and enrollment and benefits and affordability and the finance and revenue proposals. It's going to be a fun, get excited for the March 25th meeting. I wonder if there can be kind of a quick, Chair Goldberg or Bruce, I really defer to you here, your thinking on this. I wonder if there can be kind of a quick few sentences that John can offer to let folks know that, we met, that you all met, that it's going to be a really packed agenda over the course of the next few meetings. And this concept of kind of the open invitation concept that you're all talking about here.
So 2 minute, we've certainly got time for a 2-minute summary.
Yeah.
Great. In the meantime, I will make sure to get these meetings. I know we did talk about Dr. Chadwick and maybe Dwight and Cheryl as it relates to the community health component. So I can try to make sure to get the invites on their calendars if that feels helpful. Okay, so I almost set this meeting for 90 minutes because I thought that it might take 90 minutes, but I've learned my lesson in the past that usually when you think it's going to be 90 minutes, it's definitely 2 hours. So I feel like we might be able to close early. Every tag meeting, we always try to end both with an opportunity to kind of be thinking through what components from the day's meeting you'd like to bring up to the Consumer Advisory Committee. So that's the last thing on this slide deck. Before I turn there, is there anything else that you all would like to check in on before going there? Okay. So as you all know, we try to be making sure that we're all thinking about how we can be interacting with the Consumer Advisory Committee as it relates specifically to the substance of the day's meeting. Are there any specific questions that you want to be flagging for the Consumer Advisory Committee related to the scope of this tag?
Well, I would just say that to run by them the discussion about values, I think would be important. And see if they have anything to add. I wouldn't ask them to redo the values discussion, but if we missed something, let us know.
Yeah, I think asking a question in that context, you know, here's the value statement currently in the bill. Is it missing anything?
Yeah.
That might work. I mean, for the future, I think that, you know, getting their comments about the regional issue might be interesting. Again, you have to be careful, I think, to have a focus question. I mean, I can tell you that given there are several members who are from outside of the Willamette Valley, there will likely be some pretty strong support for some type of you know, regionalization of authority, presence, et cetera. Yeah, you know, I think the other question to ask is, like, when it comes to board members, what would their expectations be around behavior and the standards and accountability for board members? You know, for example, let's just say that we want the governing bodies of the single payer and perhaps any of its subsidiaries or even its major contractors to have a majority of, quote, patients or consumers. You know, that definition is really tricky. I can tell you that I had many consumer activists when I worked for Consumer Reports tell me explicitly, John, you can never represent consumers. You are a doctor. You are a doctor. You will always be a doctor. You can't stop thinking like a doctor. And while I was skeptical, I eventually came to believe that that was true. And I did represent consumers in situations where they would agree, well, they're never going to let any of us get inside those rooms. So yeah, it's okay if you go this time. But I think getting their input around that issue, because I do think there are incredible consumer patients that should be on these governing boards, should be the majority in some cases. But it will take a unique organization to find them, train them, work with them, you know, do all of those things. So that's an area we should continue to think about asking them for their input.
John, maybe you and I could try to wordsmith that question a little bit together. Usually I send the questions to you, so.
Yeah, yeah, we can do that.
Yeah.
You know, it was interesting. One of the Consumer Advisory Committee members, in response to one of our questions, actually about you know, potential sources of revenue, brought up you know, essentially income inequality issues around executives of healthcare companies, and that issue should be taken on, and you know, I think it's a governance issue for the single payer itself, a commitment to you know, not create income inequality in its own organization or its subsidiaries, and even in the organizations it contracts with. That's pretty ambitious, but so those are just some areas to think about future questions.
Should the issue of income and wealth inequality be sort of tagged as a possible value that we try to write something up about?
I think so, Chuck. We'll put that in. I mean, I found yesterday's discussion to be, pretty eye-opening.
The FNR discussion or the FNR?
The main.
Yeah.
The strategy or the main progressive tax. I think for governing it is an issue like, well, wait a minute. Can't you just focus on single payer? Isn't that enough for you guys? Do you really want to add income inequality and then add redistribution of wealth? Good God. I mean, what are you doing?
But it also raises the issue of, who can afford to be on a governing board, whether it's a regional one or a statewide, right?
Yeah.
I had a conversation recently with someone thinking of running for the legislature. Who can afford to run for the legislature? And that's always discussed, and I think it's I think that's an important issue.
Yeah. Oh, I agree.
I doubt SAFE's board has, I don't know how they did. They probably don't deal with that, right? And other public entity boards of public corporations don't deal with that, right? Who can afford to be on the board?
Right. I mean, again, I'm biased by my experience, but if you want great consumers and patients, you will pay them. You have to, because the folks coming from industry are all there, and in one way or another, they're being indirectly compensated for those activities, or they're learning so much that they're monetizing, the experience because they're in the industry.
And it shouldn't be token like we do with jurors, right?
Yeah. But I mean, I had some experience with this when I was at the VA. So, I was at the VA from 2003 to 2008. So this was still the VA, very proud of its transformation in the mid 90s. Its key transformation was to prioritize primary care, and it really reorganized and prioritized primary care. And primary care doctors were treated well and paid well, and were clearly the center of the system. And then, of course, it devoted incredible resources to information systems, which, by the way, I think is a topic that should be in governance, and should be in there. The single payer has to play a major, if not the lead role in terms of information systems. But as a result, here we were as primary care doctors, nearing 90 to 100% screening for cancer of the colon. And there was a 9-month waiting list for a colonoscopy because the gastroenterologists were making, on average at that time, I don't know how much they make now, $400,000 a year. That's twice as much as the most highly paid federal employee makes. They couldn't get any gastroenterologists. So we were telling people who had a positive screening test for cancer of the colon that, well, you got to wait 9 months. Oh, God. And so you're going to see this because you're going to see the high income earners. Some of them are going to strike back. I mean, they are in the top 1% earners, and they can command those kinds of incomes. So it'll be interesting. And your comment made me think, how many times have I heard, well, yes, the search committee had to offer a $3 million a year salary to compete for the type of hospital administrator we want. And you feel like saying, if they want $3 million, we don't want them. We just don't want that guy, or gal. But that's going to be tough.
Yeah, it wouldn't be a gal. A gal would get what, 60% of that?
But yeah, right. I should have said. But they get 1.8.
Deborah realizes they're both a problem.
Exactly.
Okay.
Okay. Well, that brings us to the end. I'd like to check in one more time to see if anyone has joined from the public who wishes to provide public comment. Okay. John, any last words from you, or?
Well, Laura, I would just tell you that I also have a dog. My wife has been keeping him busy. She has actually come into the room at times, and if my hand is on the mouse, she will put her paw up and wipe my hand off along with the mouse. So she's, I think, bigger than your dog. So she hopefully did a good job of managing her. What's her name?
His name is Henry, and the issue is yeah, that is your name.
What kind of dog is Henry?
He's a mutt, and he's 10 months old. And when I put him in the other room, he barks, and that's an even bigger distraction, I've learned. So we're working on it. It's been a process.
He's always welcome.
Thank you. I really appreciate your grace.
Yes, always welcome.
Yeah, you gotta be careful, Laurel. When we lived in New York and we lived in this nice condo, and our son brought his 50-pound Vizsla. They're wonderful dogs, high energy dogs, and we decided, we were going to leave her in the second bedroom, and we went off for 46 hours. We kind of fenced her in. She still did $2,000 of damage to the room by the time we got back.
Yeah, he's good at that too.
Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
thank you, everyone.
Thanks for a great meeting.
Yeah.
Thank
Have a
you.
good